She was one of the most photographed women of the 1990s. Versace called her the most beautiful body in the world. MTV played her image on loop. Her face sold perfume, lingerie, and the idea of desire itself. And then, to most people, she vanished. Helena Christensen didn't disappear. She did something far more interesting. She stopped being the thing everyone looked at and became the person who decides what gets seen. This is the story of a woman who spent a decade as a muse and then spent the next 2 decades becoming an author of her own image, of her own work, and eventually, of stories that have nothing to do with her at all. Copenhagen, mid-1980s. A teenage Helena enters a local pageant almost by accident, less a master plan than a moment of curiosity that got bigger than she expected. She wins. Within a short stretch, that small win snowballed into a national crown, and soon she was representing Denmark at Miss Universe in Panama, a global stage where the industry's attention tends to find you whether you asked for it or not. Helena's mother was Peruvian. Her father was Danish. She'd grown up between cultures, between languages, in a city known more for design and melancholy than for producing fashion icons. She had green eyes that photographers would later describe as haunting, a face that seemed to belong to a different era, something cinematic, slightly mysterious, hard to place in time. But none of this was her plan. The fashion industry noticed her at Miss Universe. The agents circled, the invitations arrived. By 1991, she'd moved to Paris to model full-time. Agents, casting, directors, magazine editors, they looked at Helena and saw potential, raw material for an industry that consumed beautiful women the way factories consume inputs. What mattered wasn't that it happened fast. It was that it happened to her, like the first draft of a life written by other people. Agents, editors, casting directors, each one opening a door and calling it destiny. What she saw in herself was something different, something she wouldn't fully articulate until years later. Even then, there was another part of her identity that didn't fit neatly into the story everyone else was writing. The modeling career that would make her famous was, in some sense, an interruption of an inner life that had already formed, lucrative, glamorous, and consuming enough to feel permanent while it was happening. The thing about interruptions, though, is that they can last a decade, and this one would make her one of the most recognizable women on Earth before it was through. The early 1990s supermodel industry operated on a specific logic. Women were the product, and everyone else controlled the production. Photographers chose the angle. Designers chose the clothes. Magazine editors chose which images ran and which got killed. Stylists and makeup artists and creative directors shaped every detail of how a woman would appear. The models themselves, even the most famous ones, were the raw material. Brilliant raw material, irreplaceable raw material, but material nonetheless. Their job was to be seen, to embody someone else's vision, to become a surface onto which fantasies could be projected. The best models understood this and used it, finding ways to bring their own presence into someone else's frame. But the frame was always someone else's. Helena Christensen thrived in this system. Early in the decade, Vogue put her on the kind of pages that turn a working model into a real name. Covers and editorials followed across the fashion press, and suddenly, she moved beyond simply working in the industry. She became part of what the industry looked like. In 1991, director Herb Ritts cast her in the music video for Chris Isaak's Wicked Game. Shot in Hawaii in stark black and white, it played like a fashion film that accidentally became pop culture. Wind, water, bodies moving in slow motion, and a mood that MTV couldn't stop replaying. It became an MTV staple, one of those images that defined an era's sense of what desire looked like. It didn't just chart as a video, it stuck as an era-defining image, and it even picked up major recognition at the 1991 MTV Video Music Awards. For a generation of viewers, Helena Christensen became synonymous with a particular kind of beauty, not the wholesome American cheerleader, not the avant-garde editorial provocateur, but something slower, moodier, more European. She made you feel something, even if you couldn't quite name what it was. The campaigns followed: Chanel, Prada, Valentino, Hermes. She moved through the luxury houses like someone born to be there. In 1992, she became a spokesmodel for Revlon, her face appearing in advertisements across the country. In 1994, she shot Gianni Versace's spring campaign. Versace was at the height of his powers then, dressing celebrities, defining excess, turning fashion shows into cultural events. After the shoot, he offered what might be the most reductive compliment a designer can give a model. He called her the most beautiful body in the world. It was meant as praise, the highest praise Versace's vocabulary could manage, and it was received that way. But it also captured something about the muse economy that Helena would eventually need to escape. In this world, she was a body, a face, a surface. The most beautiful one maybe, but still something to be looked at rather than someone who looks. By the mid-1990s, the supermodel phenomenon had reached a peak that would never quite be repeated. They weren't only models anymore. They had become brands, personalities, tabloid fixtures. They demanded rates that scandalized the industry. They dated rock stars and actors. They appeared on talk shows and magazine covers that had nothing to do with fashion. For a brief, strange window, they were as famous as anyone in entertainment. In 1996, the New York Times made it official. Journalist Frank DeCaro wrote about the Magnificent Seven, the definitive supermodels of the era, the women who had transcended the runway to become cultural icons. The list: Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Claudia Schiffer, Elle Macpherson, and Helena Christensen. Helena had arrived at the summit. She appeared prominently in Victoria's Secret work during that era, and her angel credit is most often placed in the late 1990s rather than the early part of the decade. She walked for every major house, Versace, Prada, Lanvin, and regularly closed shows, the position reserved for the model a designer trusts to leave the final impression. In the early 1990s, her image went truly public in a way fashion rarely does, blown up in Times Square at city scale, built to stop people mid-step and make them look. It was provocation with precision, not subtle, not forgettable, and impossible to scroll past back when the street was the feed. This was what peak visibility looked like in the supermodel age. Your face on Times Square, your body in every major campaign, your name on a list that would be referenced for decades. Helena had maximized what the muse economy could give her. But here's the thing about peaks: once you reach them, the only directions are sideways or down. The Magnificent Seven designation was the highest honor the industry could offer. It was also, in a sense, a ceiling. Helena was now officially one of the most looked at women on Earth. She had achieved what models achieve. Every future year would be measured against this moment, and the measurements would inevitably show decline. This is the trap the supermodel economy creates. It rewards youth, novelty, the hunger of the ascending. It has no good answers for what comes after the peak. Some models fight to stay visible, booking every possible job, chasing relevance as it recedes. Others simply disappear, retreating into private life once the industry moves on. Helena was already thinking about a third option. In 2002, photographer Max Vadukul offered an observation about Helena that most profiles had missed. "She sets limits," he said. "She doesn't like to be in the limelight all the time." This was unusual. The supermodel economy rewarded relentless visibility. You stayed famous by staying seen. More covers, more campaigns, more appearances, more of everything. The women who succeeded longest were often the ones who fought hardest to remain in front of the lens, who treated every appearance as a battle against obsolescence. Helena seemed to be fighting for something different. What the industry rarely advertised, and what most fans never fully clocked, was that Helena had been a photographer since before she was a model. Not as a hobby picked up during downtime between shoots. Not as an interesting side project to mention in interviews. Photography was her first creative identity, the thing she'd been doing since childhood. "I was a photographer before I was a model," she later told Beautikit magazine. While she was still at the height of her modeling career, still walking major runways and shooting major campaigns, She began working as a photographer. By the early 2000s, she wasn't just shooting for herself anymore. She was publishing, building, and putting real work into the camera side of her life, including projects tied to Nylon, the magazine she helped launch. No pivot announcement, no press tour about a new chapter or an artistic evolution. She just kept doing what she'd always done, only now with more resources and more access. The world saw a supermodel who occasionally took pictures. Helena saw it the other way around, a photographer who had simply spent a stretch of years getting famous in front of the camera. This distinction, subtle in the moment, would matter enormously for what came next. Helena had no interest in a reinvention. She was aiming for a return. Back to the identity she had before the pageants, before Paris, before the Magnificent Seven, back to being the person who decides what the world should see. The late 1990s pivot didn't read like retirement, and it definitely didn't look like a graceful fade from public life. It looked like a systematic transfer of power. In 1999, Helena co-founded Nylon magazine with publisher Marvin Jarrett. This wasn't a celebrity endorsement deal or a licensing arrangement where someone else did the work while she collected a check. She was the original creative director, the person who decided what the magazine looked like, what stories it told, what aesthetic it projected into the world. The same year, she and her childhood friend Leif Sigerson opened Boutique, a boutique in New York. They also launched a clothing line together, Christensen and Sigerson. These were real businesses requiring real involvement. Ownership stakes, not appearance fees. Consider what this meant in the context of how her career had worked until now. For a decade, Helena had been the product. Her face on someone else's magazine, her body in someone else's clothes, her image in someone else's advertisement. The creative decisions happened around her, not through her. She was essential and yet, in a fundamental way, replaceable. Another beautiful woman could always wear the dress. Now, she was becoming the person who decided what products existed in the first place. The logic extended across years and ventures. Later, she'd take on creative director roles for the Danish furniture brand Beau Concept and collaborate on a fragrance line for Strangelove Parfums. In 2007, she co-created a hair care collection with Toni and Guy. In 2012, she launched a lingerie line for Triumph in Europe. Each project followed the same principle: not just appearing, but creating. Not just being chosen, but choosing. The fashion industry is full of models who've tried to become more than models. Most of these attempts feel reactive, desperate grabs at relevance as modeling work dries up. A celebrity cookbook, a lifestyle brand that never quite coheres, a reality television, appearance that trades on fading fame. Helena's version was different because it wasn't reactive. She never scrambled for relevance as her modeling work slowed. She built infrastructure while she was still at the top, still booking major campaigns, still landing covers. The transition ran alongside her modeling career, not after it. By the time she stepped back from constant modeling in the early 2000s, returning to Copenhagen to recalibrate her life, she had something most supermodels didn't have: options that had nothing to do with her face. In 2006, Helena presented A Quiet Story at Locust Gallery in Rotterdam. The exhibition later traveled to Amsterdam. It didn't play like a celebrity side project, the kind of vanity show that gets handled gently because the name is famous. It landed as a serious photography exhibition, assessed as photography, held to the standards photographers actually face. 2 years later, her series, Far From Clothes, opened at the Dactyl Foundation in New York. The show benefited both the International Center of Photography and a charity supporting children affected by the Chernobyl disaster. Art and advocacy intertwined from the beginning. The work stayed close to the world, and it engaged with it. By now, the transformation was undeniable. Helena no longer treated photography as something she squeezed in between modeling jobs. She was working first and foremost as a photographer, someone who happened to have lived a very famous modeling life earlier. The sequence mattered. Her primary identity had shifted. "Visual storytelling is my way of communicating most profoundly how I feel inside," she said in an interview. Her subjects varied. In 2014, she shot a series called The Pursuit of Grace, featuring Liberty Ross and Liv Tyler. She photographed for Marie Claire and Elle. She shot landscapes and portraits, editorial and fine art. In 2016, she took on a role as global explorer for the Luxury Collection Hotels and Resorts, documenting a trip through Peru, her mother's homeland, through her camera. Travel, heritage, and visual storytelling converged. The through line wasn't subject matter, it was perspective. She was now the one deciding what the viewer would see. Now, it was hers. Every photograph she took represented choices she'd made: what to include, what to exclude, where to direct attention, what story to tell. The supermodel becomes the photographer, and the power relationship inverts entirely. The object becomes the author. In 2009, Helena traveled to Peru with Oxfam, the international humanitarian organization. This didn't resemble a standard celebrity photo opportunity: a quick visit, staged handshakes, then a press release full of sympathetic quotes. She went as a photographer, documenting the effects of climate change on communities in the Andes. Peru was personal. Helena's mother was Peruvian, and Helena had grown up with that heritage as part of her identity. Now, she was returning with a camera, recording what rising temperatures and shifting weather patterns were doing to people who had contributed almost nothing to the problem, but were suffering its consequences most directly. Oxfam's press materials described it clearly. She had returned to her Peruvian roots to document the dramatic effects that climate change is having. The photographs from that trip were exhibited at climate summits in New York, Washington, London, and Copenhagen. They weren't fashion photography. They weren't celebrity portraiture. They were advocacy images, pictures designed to make viewers see something they'd rather ignore: glaciers receding, water sources disappearing, communities adapting to changes they didn't cause. Helena had become an Oxfam Global Ambassador, and the Peru trip was just the beginning. In 2010, she traveled to Nepal to document glacier melt in the Himalayas. In 2011, she went to Kenya to photograph drought conditions affecting communities across East Africa. In 2012, she published a booklet of her climate photographs for the Rio+20 UN Summit, calling on governments to take action. The pattern was consistent. She used the specific skill that defined her second act, photography, as a tool for causes larger than herself. The camera wasn't only for art, it became a tool for amplification. In 2015, she began volunteering with UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. 4 years later, in June 2019, she was officially appointed a UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador. The role was explicitly tied to her work behind the camera. As UNHCR described it, she would support UNHCR in telling the stories of the forcibly displaced and building empathy for refugees. In 2023, she traveled to Colombia with UNHCR, meeting displaced families and leading photography workshops with indigenous communities. She didn't just lend her name to a cause. She showed up, did the work, and used her camera to decide which stories needed to be seen. The woman who had once been the subject now amplified subjects the world would rather not see: climate refugees, displaced families, people whose faces would never appear on magazine covers, but whose lives, Helena believed, deserved to be witnessed. Helena Christensen never retired from modeling. That matters. In September 2017, she walked the runway at Milan Fashion Week for the Versace Spring-Summer 2018 show. Alongside Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Claudia Schiffer, and Carla Bruni, in a tribute to Gianni Versace and the era they helped define. Gianni had been gone for 20 years. The industry he shaped had changed in ways both obvious and subtle, but those women still knew how to stop a room. The fashion press covered it as a comeback, a return, a reminder of past glory. The nostalgic narrative was irresistible. The supermodels were back. And that's where the misunderstanding begins. If you only knew Helena as a billboard face and a campaign body, anything less than constant visibility can look like a disappearance. But her later appearances follow a clear pattern. She shows up selectively and only when it suits the work, the moment, and the people involved. In 2019, she appeared in Dolce & Gabbana's Spring, Summer campaign alongside Carla Bruni, Eva Herzegovina, and other models from her generation. She still books covers when they interest her. She can still command a runway. The difference is control. She decides when, where, and why. Helena once described the proportions of her life as 40% modeling, 40% photography, 20% weird stuff. The precision is probably not meant to be taken literally, but the split tells you something real. Modeling is part of her life, not the whole story. Photography equals it. And then there's the undefinable remainder, the creative roles, the humanitarian work, the projects that don't fit neatly into categories anyone else created. She has a son, Mingus, born in 1999 with actor Norman Reedus. These days, the rhythm reads less like constant visibility and more like choosing where the work and the life actually fit. She continues working with UNHCR, using photography to help tell refugee stories. And she still steps onto a runway now and then when the occasion feels right and the invitation comes from people she respects. In 2024, she received recognition tied less to runway nostalgia and more to what she built after peak fame: creative work, advocacy, and a long second act that didn't depend on staying in constant rotation. What really happened to Helena Christensen is simpler than the myth. Time didn't defeat her, and the industry didn't erase her. She shifted the terms and kept the part that mattered. The usual script goes something like this: you're discovered young, you rise fast, you peak in your 20s or early 30s, and then you face a binary choice. Either you fight desperately to stay visible, booking every possible job, denying the passage of time, or you disappear into private life once the industry moves on to younger faces. The system uses you while you're useful and has no particular interest in what happens after. Helena wrote a different script. She converted the visibility she'd accumulated into something more durable: creative control, ownership stakes, skills that appreciate rather than depreciate with age. She extracted value from the muse economy while she could, and then she built something else entirely. That something else turned out to include gallery exhibitions, and climate advocacy, and refugee documentation, and magazine publishing, and selective runway appearances, and work that matters beyond the fashion industry's narrow definitions of relevance. The supermodel era made her famous for being looked at. The years since have been about looking, deciding what deserves attention, whose stories get told, what images make it into the shot, and which get left out. There's a particular kind of success story that the fashion industry loves to celebrate: the model who stays forever young, who appears on covers at 50 the way she did at 25, who proves that beauty can be preserved through sheer determination. It's a narrative about winning, about beating time, about refusing to be diminished by age. Helena Christensen tells a different kind of story. Not about staying the same, but about becoming something else. Not about clutching power, but about changing what kind of power matters to you. She started as someone else's discovery, an accidental pageant winner who happened to have the face the 1990s wanted. She became one of the most photographed women alive, part of a cohort that redefined what models could be and what they could demand. And then, deliberately, she moved from the front of the camera to behind it, from subject to author, from muse to maker, from the person in the shot to the person shaping what the shot becomes. The 2017 Versace reunion proved she could still do what she'd always done. The runway still responded to her presence. The cameras still wanted her image. The industry still knew her name. It also proved something else. She didn't need any of it to have a life that made sense. She showed up on her own terms, with plenty of other places to put her time. That's the difference between fame as a trap and fame as a tool. For the past 2 decades, she's used the camera and the access her fame unlocked to spotlight people the fashion world rarely makes room for. The most photographed woman of the 1990s now photographs others. The woman who was called the most beautiful body in the world now decides whose bodies and faces deserve to be seen. Maybe that's the real answer to what happened to Helena Christensen. She didn't vanish. She didn't fade. She changed the terms. She picked up a camera and pointed it at something that mattered more than her own reflection.